Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Teddy Downey, executive editor here at the Capital Forum. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Gene Burrus, founder of Burrus Competition Strategies. Gene previously has held roles at Spotify, Microsoft, and American Airlines, where he focused on competition policy, pricing, strategy, and regulatory issues across transportation and technology markets. Gene, thank you so much for doing this today.
Happy to do it. Great to be returning back to the airline industry for a bit today.
And before we get going, for our listeners, if you have a question, please put them in the chat function, please, or put it in the Q&A panel. Get us your questions. We'll get to them later on in the conversation. But uh, so much going on right now in the airline industry, Gene. I would love to talk about just the difference between competition from when you were in the industry versus now, just how that competitive landscape has changed. I know there's a lot of language around deregulation this and regulation that, but like just tell us how that landscape has changed, how much more concentrated it is, how you perceive the industry then versus now.
I think the single biggest change, obviously, is the consolidation that we've seen in the last 20 years, where, when I was at American Airlines from 1997 to 2002, and there were a lot more major carriers back then, right? And we're down now to, four essentially, right? Four and a half maybe, but the level of consolidation has been, I think, the most dramatic change that we've seen, and I think it's therefore changed the competitive dynamics. One prime example that I like to point to, back when I was in the industry in the late 90s, early 2000s, profitability or not depended on what your average load factor might be. And if you were at 68% load factor, you were going to lose money. If you were at 70, you were going to break even. If you were at 72, you were going to be highly profitable, right? But you think if you've flown at all in the last 10 years, 70% load factors are a thing of the past, right? They have been able to coordinate or watch each other's capacity constraints or whatever the case may be. But capacity is now limited where you're in the 90s now for load factors. There's never an empty seat going, right? And so there's been a big difference, and I think the consolidation has contributed to that for sure.
And we were talking a little bit about this before the call, but we have a product that you mentioned coordination. We have a product here called Coordination Out Loud at the Capital Forum where we track executive commentary. I wanted to ask you if any of the executive commentary that you've heard recently is at all surprising uh, in such a consolidated industry.
Yeah, I'd say that, a recent comment by the United CEO in public where he was saying we intend to, or we're going to have to raise our fares this summer. That is the kind of statement. A couple of things were going on. If the CEO of American Airlines back in the late 1990s made any kind of public statement with regard to their intent to raise fares in the future, it literally 5 minutes. In 5 minutes, I would have gotten a call from DOJ with threats of jail time for the CEO, and that doesn't seem to have been the reaction to the United CEO's statement right then. And two, it was formerly governed back then by the ATP co-consent decree, where the carriers were accused of coordinating, fares in advance using the ATP co-system. And so any public statement regarding intent on fares was strictly prohibited by that too. So it was a very different and much more, I would say DOJ was paying a lot more attention to them, and I don't, than they are today for whatever reason. It was kind of surprising to me.
Why do you think that is? Because uh, we see, obviously we have a whole product design around this. Occasionally, we will see some private plaintiff cases pop up later on if there are price increases, if there is super profitable periods for these companies after they sort of invite each other to collude, but not as much attention, job owning, investigation as you might think from DOJ and FTC. But more generally, like I would say across administrations, certainly we're seeing a dramatic drop off. Now, I think we can all agree in that the personnel is huge personnel issues, 30% attrition in both agencies, if not more. Leadership thinks mergers are mostly okay. But beyond that, across administrations, you're seeing a lot less aggressive crackdown on invitations to collude and otherwise questionable coordination of conduct. Why do you think that is?
It's a very good question. I'm not sure exactly because it really should be the nuts and bolts for DOJ. I mean, whatever people think about mergers or Section 2 conduct, everyone there's not a lot of disagreement that price coordination is a bad thing and ought not to be allowed, right? Uh but you're right. I think on the this kind of public negotiation, so to speak, there just seems to be a lot less on the. I mean, on the private side, it's tough to bring the case just because you have to still prove an agreement, and and you kind of lack the evidence to prove the agreement. You see the results, but it's kind of the tacit winks that happen after the public negotiation. But that's why it should be the realm of DOJ and FTC to like step in immediately and remind them of what I assume still is the antitrust training within the companies that you're not supposed to talk about those things in public. But maybe it's just that it's deep in the rear view. Things like the ATPCO case and the consent decrees that were in place there are kind of deep in the rear view mirror, and you've got newer executives and staffs that haven't had their hands slapped by the regulators, so they either don't know the rules or are figure they can get away with it. So, and I don't know why the agencies have kind of dropped the ball on this though.
We've seen state AGs pick up the slack for federal lack of enforcement when it comes to competition law. Po- do you see these problems in the airline industry becoming acute enough for states and municipalities to take a closer look and step up and say, "Hey, we have a problem here." I know that's asking a lot. They're already resource constrained with the Live Nation lawsuit, with mergers that they're blocking, with much, much lower staffing levels than you have at DOJ and FTC. But at some point, and these prices are high enough, it's really going to affect commerce generally. It has a huge effect on cities when a hub is dominated or airlines pull out. I mean, there's an expectation with Spirit leaving Florida that your flights to Florida will dramatically increase in costs. At the same time, you have this shortage in airline fuel, as you mentioned, causing executives to say they're going to increase their prices by 30%, what have you. Do you think state AGs can play a role here, or how do are we just going to have to wait until DOJ and FTC wake up?
I'm guessing for both resource constraint reasons and airline markets are kind of actually nationwide and worldwide to some degree, right? Capacity can't just move from route to route within a country. It can literally move to somewhere else in the world if they need it to. So to some degree, they're worldwide markets. On the other hand, everything is local, and it really where a hub is dominated by a particular carrier, that it has huge impact on prices for those local customers most of all, right? And so there's a reason for the state AGs to probably have a keener interest sometimes in what's going on in a local hub market than even DOJ might. But that's balanced against the fact of like, the Georgia AG is not going to go after Delta Airlines because Delta Airlines is like, a major employer in Atlanta and, and a huge, piece of the state economy. So the politics are difficult for a state AG, when they're faced with even a complete monopoly over a hub market, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great point. And there's also a disconnect. Maybe the if that state AG were so inclined, they could open up a market for a lot of people if they wanted to get into whatever the conduct was at the specific airport that is
Right.
dominated by the airline. So a bit of a tricky problem if the federal enforcers don't get involved. Um, I want to talk a little bit more about pricing and algorithmic pricing.
Yeah.
We write a lot here about algorithmic price fixing. We've written about some of the different ways in which airlines maybe engage with that kind of algorithm, with different algorithmic pricing tools and how that could be a potential violation of law. How do like, what's your, and again, you have this historical perspective. What was it like around that issue when you were there versus now? How has the law evolved, and how do you think policymakers and law enforcers and regulators should think about algorithmic pricing in the airline industry?
So I would say, the thing that's changed the most, I think, is the technology that truly can today allow very personalized pricing for anybody because they kind of know all about you, or if they don't, the search engines do, and they can identify almost to the penny your willingness to pay for a particular route on a particular day. I would say it was a dream back then that they might be able to do something, but a dream that they almost were afraid to speak out loud just because they were worried, one, about the reaction of Congress or the DOT in what they would do back then, and then B, I think because there was a lot less consolidation, there was a lot more threat of like, well, that, if we tried it and people found out, we would immediately get slammed by the competition. And so there's no way we could pull it off. I think that's changed today that there's only the four major carriers and they probably think there's a lot more likelihood that others might go along. I mean, to some degree, the personalized pricing is just a dramatically more sophisticated way of discriminating on a price basis than, back then it was, are you staying over a weekend or not, to distinguish between tourists versus business travelers, right? And they would so there was all kinds of efforts to do exactly that, but it was just a lot more, I would say, with a sledgehammer instead of a scalpel, that they would try to separate business travelers from leisure travelers. And that's how you fill a plane with perishable inventory, basically, there's the last seat going out on that plane, really, you could sell for $5, and that's still good, but you just have to make sure that not everyone gets access to that $5 fare, right? So
Yeah, yeah. It'll be interesting to see how. I mean, obviously you have unfairness laws at the state level. You have of states pushing ahead with the personalized pricing bans and things like that. So we're
I
certainly gonna keep an eye on whether or not.
I think the level of sophistication now, I'm not sure the law has evolved technically to address it yet. There was the idea floated last year by I think it was the Delta Airlines CEO floated the idea of this kind of personalized pricing, and immediately American Airlines CEO jumped in and says we would never do that, right? So there was, even though all of them probably do it to some degree, like I said, whether it's whether it's trying to sort people out based on, the nature of the fare they're buying or how far in advance they're buying it, that sort of thing. That's always been done. So there's always been a little of it. But this idea that you'd have to like try to disguise yourself to go buy a fare to get a good deal is new. It's the technology, and I'm not sure the law is ready to deal with it if it was done, if it was clearly being done. That said, there's obviously, I think, a lot of political reasons to think that if it became well known that it was being done, that it would probably result in legislation either at the state level or at the federal level. So
Yeah, I think I mean, to the work that we've done, I think we're pretty sure that it's going on. I mean, you had that, was it, uh, what was the airline that got in trouble recently for, oh, you just, man, we wrote about it the other day, but some airline had a tweet oh, you're
oh
having a
yeah, yeah,
persistently high price, just clear
just
your cache in your browser. You restart your browser.
yeah,
JetBlue.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Which
Thank you, Aaron
that's
Source. Yeah.
very, yeah, very interesting. Yeah, whether that's an admission or not is interesting. But and the degree that's the problem too is
Look, I have people will be next to each other looking at the flights in my
yeah,
family and be like, hey, it's $600, it's 450. I mean, it's clearly going on. I mean,
yeah,
there's enough evidence that it's going on, I think.
yeah.
It's more a question of, is it going to be a hard Section 1 case from a private plaintiff, or is it going to be, and like we've looked into some of these intermediary data providers. And I guess that was a question I had. Did you guys have data providers that were sort of these intermediaries back then? It sounds like you had a consent agreement. I'd actually
So
forgotten about that.
back then, it was actually an interesting time back then because if you think back then the internet was kind of in its infancy. You couldn't really buy tickets on the internet. It was ATPCO and it was travel agencies and you could, I was part of the team that helped put together Orbitz back then, which was a joint venture by a few airlines to have an online travel agency that would work. So that was in its infancy. So it was all done through Sabre and Apollo and ATPCO, and so that's the way things work. It's a lot more, there's a lot more ways to get at the data now, and everybody's doing searches through a variety of different places where data can be gathered and then attached to that particular person or that particular IP address, and then they can make their decisions on what they'll offer you or not, unfortunately. So
I mean, you mentioned a lot of these third-party players, but a lot of those have consolidated as well. Orbitz
very much.
is now consolidated in a big conglomerate
Yep.
of whatever. I don't even know what those apps are even called at this point. You've got Sabre was bought by Google, right?
Well,
I
yeah,
mean,
yeah, yeah.
right? So, I mean, you have all these. You had it what sounded like almost like a little bit of a competitive market in these intermediaries, and now.
Well, that was the idea, right? That the airlines didn't like the fact that they were, basically subject to these fees from Sabre, booking fees from Sabre and Apollo. And so that's why they set out to kind of create an internet thing. And then for a while, there was a lot of competition in the internet space. And then, of course, they've consolidated down. I don't know exactly what they think of the online, but my guess is that the airlines and Expedia are not friends right now, right? So,
Yeah, yeah. It's just an interesting dynamic where when you were there, you had all these different players, and now it's
yeah.
kind of four airlines, one,
One
one
or two online
online
bookings. Yeah.
broker.
Yeah.
Yeah. The choice has diminished dramatically. Um,
Yeah.
let's talk about Spirit because we're talking about, I think it's four companies. Uh, uh, that you mentioned, the four big airlines control what, 80% of flights now. Spirit obviously play, as I want to get the terminology right. Ultra low cost carrier, right?
Yep.
These ultra low cost carriers obviously play a big role in constraining prices, even though they're not really competing in the same way as the big four. I mean, even Southwest was a low cost carrier and now is just one of the big players now. They solidified that by joining their peers in charging for bag fees
And
uh,
and picking seats in advance.
and
Yeah.
picking seats in advance and just generally making you miserable when you fly. There, um, but what is, I'm curious to get your thoughts on what's going on right now with these ultra low cost carriers. Obviously, they're struggling since COVID. Spirit has gone out of business. Um, I think the most obvious thing in many tracks is the price of jet fuel going up most recently, but is it even viable with the big four being so dominant now and controlling airports and just having so much control over competition for anyone to survive as an ultra low cost carrier or as a sort of ancillary player in this market?
It's super hard, but I don't think it's anything new. When I was an American, the biggest part of my job day to day was defending the predatory pricing lawsuit that DOJ brought against American Airlines, and that was ostensibly, the client the government had back then was called Vanguard Airlines, that was a ultra low cost carrier that popped up and tried to fly the Wichita Dallas route. Now, why is Wichita Dallas important to American Airlines? Just because every flight in and out of Dallas is important to American Airlines. And so the difficulty is, while they have lower cost structures, just both because of their labor costs are a lot lower and they tend to use older aircraft, so their capital costs maybe are a lot lower initially. They offer it, but they can only offer it on the local route, right? And so Americans flights from Wichita to Dallas are filled with not only Wichita Dallas customers, but they're also filled with Wichita to the rest of the world customers. And so they can they can push up capacity and lower the local fares without really necessarily hurting their profitability. And quite frankly, they have every incentive to do so. And so it's always been a difficult row to hoe just because of the economics that the hub and spoke system bring to the industry. And it's hugely efficient, and it makes for frequent daily flights, either one stop or nonstop to lots of different places. And that's just a much more attractive product. So, if they end up not being able really to compete that hard on price, or they can't fill their planes at a particular price, and so it's a they end up it's a difficult thing to compete against, and I'm not sure there are laws that prohibit it. American prevailed in that predatory pricing case a long time ago. I think because at the end of the day, the marginal cost of a seat is actually quite low when you think about it, and it's hard to say that Americans shouldn't be able to match their competitors' prices, and so that ends up what happens, I think. So.
Um, Fuel prices are super volatile now and are just high in general, just given the war in Iran. Um, how do you see airlines dealing with this? And then, there's this short-term problem, and then I kind of want to take a step back after that and talk more structurally.
So they might try to coordinate price increases this summer, which it sounds like at least America United floated that possibility to the industry. You know, different airlines have different fuel hedging strategies, so some of them can start, those only last so long, but they can smooth out the price fluctuations a little bit with fuel hedging, so that they might have a cost advantage over some of their rivals if they've made the right bets in terms of hedging on fuel costs. But, at the end of the day, prices are probably going to rise as a result, and they always rise faster than they come back down. If the war were to end tomorrow and fuel prices dropped back and oil went back down to $70 a barrel, then my guess is you wouldn't see the prices, race to meet that too, unfortunately. But I think you'll see a rise. The question is, will it impact demand or not? And probably no one knows for sure the answer to that. But my guess is you'll see a drop off in demand as a result. And then what they do in response to that will be interesting to see, because for a long time, one of the bigger constraints on capacity in the industry is availability of new aircraft. There's only another consolidation in the industry is that there are only really two players making big jets anymore, and their assembly lines kind of dictate the capacity of the industry as a whole. So
That's interesting. I mean, we don't spend a lot of time talking about the country. I mean, there is a lot of talk about Boeing and Airbus, but not in terms of like how they can dictate how many seats there are
they
in the ecosystem.
That's literally the case. And when Boeing had the issues with the Max 737s, that limited industry capacity for a long time, right? So, and you can go get planes out of the desert sometimes, and I don't know where Spirit's planes are going to go, or whether I don't know whether JetBlue had long-term plans for Spirit's physical aircraft, or whether they were kind of on their last legs anyway. But there are limits to the capacity because of that constraint. I say that, before I was a lawyer, I was actually a aerospace engineer working for McDonnell Douglas on MD-11. So before
Wow.
consolidation, yeah.
So I want to take a step back here because, I think the popular media is, or the business media, I should say, is like, oh, it was Lena Khan's fault that she blocked the JetBlue Spirit merger, which is, it just feels totally disingenuous for A, it was DOJ, B, they declined to get bought subsequently by Frontier. I mean,
Yeah.
and then Trump tried to bail them out, and then with a with or not bail them out, but come up with a plan, and the debt holders rejected it. So there's just so much evidence that it had nothing to do with that merger getting blocked, which of course also was blocked in court by
I
a
was going to say,
conservative judge as being illegal. So I find it hard to see how that was a problem. But you mentioned a lot of things already. One, a lot of coordination, tremendous amount of consolidation. Uh, I will just say, I'm curious if you agree. The experience of flying as a customer, as a citizen in this country is far, far more miserable today than it was in the 90s in almost every respect, I would say. Um, what is the solution here? We've even mentioned consolidation up and down the supply chain in the manufacturers, in the intermediaries, in the data providers. I mean, the ability to coordinate, the ability to make you miserable as a customer, the ability to crowd out your competitors just seems extreme at this point. So what is the solution? Is it breaking them up? Is it re-regulation? I mean, you've even mentioned the DOJ, and I should mention the DOT.
yep.
The DOT could step in when it comes to predatory pricing. They never do. The DOT could come in with rules to restrict these dominant firms. They never do. They could have more, I mean, I think Pete Buttigieg, Secretary Buttigieg did on the margin start to try to do some things to make you less miserable as a customer. But for the most part, we're talking about tinkering around the edges. What needs to happen here for this market to be more competitive and make more sense?
Yeah, it's a very good question. If I had the answer, maybe I'd be Secretary of Transportation. But there are some things that you can do, I think, to change the incentives. I mean, and whether it's an act of Congress, there's debates every now and then, and there have been for 30 years over like passenger bills of rights that Congress might pass that I assume DOT would be in charge of enforcing. But and I'm not there's strong arguments against a lot of the things that they might try to do in that regard. If you fly in Europe and you get delayed for 6 hours, you get a big fat check from the airline, right? And I've gotten one before when they had, even if it's on a US airline that's flying out of a European airport, that changes the incentives, right? And they said, depending on the size of the incentives they can put in, it can either make them build a lot more leeway into their schedules so they aren't late or not, that sort of thing. There are a lot of things they could do in terms of compensating, passengers that get bumped and then they don't oversell flights too. And it just depends on the particular thing that is making you miserable on a given flight. And some of them, have even been discussed, like, even to the level of, do we get rid of TSA and go back to what we had before 2001 again in terms of airport security. I don't, there's a lot of government employees that probably don't think that's a very good idea, but once upon a time there was no TSA, and that's part of what makes flying miserable today too. So there are, every little thing you notice that could be different. But I was having a discussion with somebody the other day. They're saying, I'm just mad. I have to pay extra for my Coke and for my bags, right? And if you like to drink a Coke and you like to check a bag, that's true. But on the other hand, for me, if I'm not checking a bag and I don't like a Coke, I like that I don't have to pay for that anymore. So there, for everything that's making somebody else upset, it might actually be catering to a different customer. And so it might not be as bad as we think it is compared to the history, though I think the capacity constraints and the coordination on pricing, there needs to be, I'd say, clear messages, whether it's the DOJ says you're going to stop that or we're going to sue you again, and we'll have another 15 years of a consent decree in place if that's what you really want, or whether it's DOT going through some rulemaking and putting in rules that amount to what the ATP consent decree was a long time ago. That would help. But and unwinding the consolidation, I just don't know how they do it now is part of the problem, right? Without introducing chaos into the system, and probably a worse flying experience, at least in the short run, for everybody if they did that. So there's no easy answer, is what it comes down to.
We've got some listener questions. I want to make sure I get to these. First one, do you think the collapse of Spirit signals a shift away from all budget-friendly carriers, or was that more Spirit specific?
I think it's probably Spirit specific, just where they were in their life cycle and the way they had, accumulated debt or run out of capital to some degree. That said, there is an old saying from back when I was in the industry that the way to make a small fortune in the airline industry is to start with a big one, and there's always somebody with a big one that wants to go give it a try because it's kind of like it doesn't have perhaps the glamour that it had in the 60s, 70s, 80s that it does now. But you can go find a few airplanes and start thinking I can do better or offer something a little better. And it's been going on cyclically for ever since deregulation, really. So I my guess is you'll see new budget friendly with lower cost structures, lower capital costs, that sort of thing, that try to cater to the lower end. And there's always somebody else willing to give it a try. So
Um, we've got another question here. Again, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A panel or in the chat. Got a few questions coming in. Next question here. It's not really a question. I'm not 100% sure what it means, but information inputs needed for dynamic pricing products. I'm guessing the question is around, like, when does this become a problem?
that may be related to what we were discussing before about the technology that has changed so dramatically, and the access to information that airlines or data providers or search engines or others have about individual customers now is so dramatically greater than they had 25 years ago, that it has made dynamic personalized pricing possible and effectively possible. And the question now is, either is there a way to restrict the use of that data, and or do we want to? Because I guarantee you could have somebody on this podcast next week who's an economist that would tell you how it's the great, how price discrimination in the airline industry is the greatest thing ever, because it gives people with low propensity to pay access to that expiring inventory at a very low price, right?
There are no shortage of people trying to tell me how great dynamic pricing is, but
Exactly.
then no shortage of people who are on the who I talk to about it who say that seems really unfair. So yeah, I give economists a lot of credit for being perhaps the most out of touch
I'm not in
people in the
that camp,
world.
but
Yeah, yeah,
my guess is I would be a victim of the higher pricing. So
yeah.
exactly.
Um, Another question here. Do executives at any of the major airlines regret deregulation of their industry, either in general or as executed?
It's a very good question. And there was not, there was sentiment, certainly at American Airlines 25 years ago, that maybe we'd be better off if we just re-regulated the whole industry because there wouldn't be all of these pressures on, on the executive suite to make money every month. And uh, so there's some of that. I don't think on the whole, though, that re-regulation would improve things for people. It's like, yes, perhaps the regulators are a little better educated about the dynamics of the airline industry and even the hub and spoke model, which didn't really exist before deregulation. Uh, that has opened up thousands of markets that just couldn't exist before. The other thing that's changed too which is why I think still the deregulated market is the best way to take advantage of this is technology of the aircraft themselves, right? Suddenly there are regional jets that are able to fly, thinner markets on a point-to-point basis and they're very efficiently that those things didn't exist. And so the technology has changed too. Even the idea of we have wide body aircraft that are much smaller than a 747 was back in the 1990s, which can fly thinner international routes too. So all of those are ill-suited for a regulator to come in and decide where people can fly and what planes can fly and what crews can fly, that sort of thing. That's, I think while there is perhaps some sentiment of like, oh, we could all, it would be a very cushy job to have and a very cushy industry to be in if we were just regulated and kind of guaranteed a return. We wouldn't have to worry about all those things anymore. But I don't think there's that possibility really. So
At what point do you think uh, the bad results subsequent to deregulation will cause politicians to uh, consider reforms? We've talked about mass consolidation up and down the supply chain. We've talked about, I mean, we haven't, I mentioned it, but there are a lot of cities that have been decimated by the choice of executives at these airlines to abandon them or to dominate their hub and just and increase the cost for everyone in that region. There are There's been huge numbers of bankruptcies subsequent to deregulation that didn't happen when before. I would argue the innovations have all been to, again, manipulate people and make them miserable for the most part. The technological advancement probably would have happened anyway. Or we're actually not getting as much technological advancement because, as you mentioned, the two suppliers are an oligopoly that are making things worse. They're engineering things worse than they were historically. So pretty much every single shred of evidence since deregulation is that it's been a failure, at least what leaving up to these executives to determine, and now they're colluding out loud in a pretty lawless way. Is there at some point just a political outrage that this thing that to most people seems like a utility, seems more like a railroad than anything else in terms of like, I just want to get from point A to point B. I don't want to be gouged. How can we do this more reasonably? I don't want to be packed in like a sardine. I don't want to pay for air in the bathroom and whatnot. You
yeah,
know, it actually. at some point this just seems unsustainable that 30% price increases and then they're going to be sticky because no one holds anyone accountable anymore. It just seems like there's going to be a reaction here, and even if your view is, well, I don't see it happening, like at what point do is there a political reaction in your view?
Yeah, I mean, if we see 30% price increases this summer as a result of the oil price increases, that's going to get people's attention. So I could see, there's always, I would say Congress is always on the edge of we need a passenger bill of rights. I mean, you're one congressman having a bad delay or a bad experience on a flight back to their district that they're going to get motivated to do something. And so, and historically, honestly, that's the way a lot of the airline regs have come to pass. There's a reason why you can fly, there's a reason why you can fly from DCA to the West Coast now, where you couldn't in the 1990s. But John McCain didn't like having to change planes to get back to Phoenix or didn't like having to drive out to Dulles to get to Phoenix. So they said low-cost carriers get special slots to come into DCA. And it was America West back then. But literally, it's individual congressmen's bad experiences on flights that sometimes make stuff like that happen. So they aren't necessarily price sensitive because somebody else is paying for their tickets back and forth. But I could see this summer being a key catalyst. It's a, there's and without a lot of partisan disagreement on it either. So I think it's always on the edge of happening, and so I think you could see something happening. Obviously, the airline lobbies would be very much opposed to anything like that, but whether it's a passenger bill of rights that says, at least dictates things like how does ticket pricing, what does it have to include? What does it have to exclude? How do you not get surprised by junk fees or baggage fees or whatever the case may be? I could see that getting regulated again, or being put to the DOT to do rulemaking on those fronts. So and things like compensation for oversales and compensation for delays and things like that. I think it's always on the back burner, and it won't take much to get it on the front. So
Another question here. Do you think there's any impact on pricing or potential coordination via major firms like Vanguard or BlackRock that have common ownership of the major airlines?
an interesting question, and I think it's a broader question that extends far outside the airline industry, actually, on their common ownership, and maybe sometimes whether it's overlapping board seats or they have common board seats on maybe all of these companies in a particular industry, and the airlines are one of those. It certainly is something that has been studied a little bit by DOJ. I know Jonathan Cantor was very interested in that topic. Probably a little less interest now than there was, a few years ago. But it's it's an issue that I think has some reason to be concerned about, as the common ownership. There's always been rules against overlapping directors between competitors, but the common ownership kind of creates the same incentives, maybe just to a little bit of a lesser degree. So
I'm curious, when you were there, I mean, I've certainly been when I was at an investment bank in the room at some of these meetings with these investors and the executives, and they definitely aren't unafraid to say, stuff. Maybe it's not like we don't like competition outright, but we strongly discourage you from getting in a price war or whatever they're gonna say. I mean, they did not seem shy, at least when I was in the room. And those were like I wasn't like I was in a pretty big room. So I
yeah, yeah.
imagine when there's a small room is smaller, did you get what was your impression? Did you do any of those investor meetings when you were at the airline, or what was your is your I mean, does your view that that can be a problem come from your personal experience in addition to the research that's out there? Because I've seen the research too, but when I was there, I sort of
I say no, but I would say the degree of, common ownership, it was the investment banks didn't hold the sway, I would say in the 90s that they do today. It wasn't, there were, like California
but
public
when
pension.
they set up the meetings, I mean, the investment banks ostensibly set up the meetings with, I mean, I guess you could just get a meeting directly with the pension fund or BlackRock or Vanguard now, but those meetings where the investors are in the room, did that, were the executives listening to that really, or were they?
Not, I did not experience that really. So yeah.
Um, Here's another question. Do you see any mergers of existing airlines today that have not happened yet, but could benefit industry structure?
Hmm. It's a good question. I mean, you could argue that Spirit Frontier might have at least helped a little bit, but and they just got through the Alaska Hawaiian merger. We'll see how that either benefits or doesn't benefit, or does it that's why I said 4.5. Does it make is Alaska Hawaiian and I'd probably say that with a little West Coast bias that Alaska's got a lot more presence here than they do other places, so it seems a lot more significant. But does is Alaska Hawaiian a potential fifth carrier maybe that will emerge out of all of this? Other than that, it's hard to see. I can't see it benefiting the industry structure that any of the majors would be allowed to pick up, like American JetBlue or something like that. It just doesn't seem like it would pass muster, and I don't see how it would benefit anyone. So
One of the things that comes up a lot when you're talking about the airlines is they make their money with credit cards and their relationship with banks. Last night, there was reporting that Rohit Chopra is going to be the new California Consumer Protection and Business Regulation head of that new division. Um, do you think that a crackdown from the financial side on how airlines do points, the arrangements that they have with banks could be a pressure point or a potential risk uh, to their business model, just given how reliant they are on those credit card revenues?
I think it's a threat, but I can't see the politics that gets it done, because the reason those programs are so effective for the airline's bottom line is people love them, right? I mean, people go out of their way to keep their frequent flyer miles and keep their loyalty points and make sure they have their lounge access and their at least opportunity to get upgraded. If you're going to tell people like, sorry, you're just going to have to pick the lowest fare and go with the commodity carrier, that people aren't the frequent flyers will not like that, right? There's a reason why those things are popular, is because they're popular. So I don't, the politics on that are pretty bad, actually, I think.
Don't they manipulate the value of the points though with like no accountability? And so people certainly don't like that.
They don't. I mean, and you could see some pro-consumer regulation, I guess, on maybe devaluating the points currency or something like that, because everyone does experience that. But that said, it's surprising how even sophisticated consumers are kind of just really paying a lot of it turns out paying a lot of money at the end of the day for not much. But the perception is different even for very sophisticated consumers. So
Um, any other thoughts? I know you're in both the tech, you're more focused on tech policy now in your role, and you worked at Microsoft, you worked at Spotify, you've worked in tech for a long time in addition to your work at the airlines. Um, how do you see uh, you know, policy developing around consolidation more generally? And do you see any uh, general change? Do you see any change more broadly in politicians being willing to take on consolidated industries. I think there's like an optimistic view for people who think there's too much concentration, where you look at Live Nation and you look at some mergers that are getting challenged at the state level, and then you say, well, at some point, Congress might switch hands and there might be more interest here. But I think you could take a much more pessimistic view and say, well, no one running for office right now is even willing to talk about AI because they're so scared that AI will throw money into their race. No one will talk about cryptocurrency because they're so money that crypto will throw money into their race. And so are you sort of on an optimist that will get more competition enforcement and more competition from in the tech and airline industry generally, or a pessimist and it's nothing but consolidated domination for the foreseeable future?
I would say I'm an optimist, and mostly because I think actually antitrust enforcement is a lot more bipartisan today than it ever has been in my entire career. And so, like, when I started as a baby lawyer back in the early 90s, I worked for a firm where everyone was a former antitrust lawyer that had to learn to be an environmental lawyer, right? Because the Reagan administration had kind of done away with antitrust enforcement, and there was a strong, I would say the Republican Party back then stood for no enforcement, and if they could have gotten away with it, repeal of the Sherman Act, right? But back then, that changed dramatically in the last 10, 15 years, I think. And, the, while it's certainly not the same as, the approach that Jonathan Cantor and Lena Khan took to enforcement is not the same approach that the Trump administration has taken. But it's a lot more consistent than it used to be when you changed administrations. Like if you went from Joel Klein to Charles James, it was a 180 degree turn on antitrust enforcement. Now it's more course correction now between administrations. So I am actually I think it's more bipartisan today than it ever has been.
And do you see that on your tech issues? Like, and where is that overlap? I think we've seen some of that from the sort of the anti-monopoly movement on the left and this kind of new right coalition
Yep.
or new right thinkers in
Yep.
the Republican Party. Is that where you're seeing the overlap on your issues?
I think so. And a great example is I've worked on the Google antitrust cases when I was at Microsoft, and then later I was a consultant to the state AGs that were investigating the search and the Android cases and the ad tech cases. And, we convinced Bill Barr at the DOJ under the first Trump administration to bring the lawsuits against Google, which that would have never happened under any other Republican administration. And then, of course, those cases were continued by Jonathan Cantor when he came in afterwards. And you've got almost got a similar dynamic playing out now where Cantor brought a case against Apple. It's not like the current administration walked in and got an immediate settlement out of the new AAG. So there is a lot of continuity. There's maybe more agreement on the Section 2 side of things than there ever has been. Mergers are a different story, I think, where there's probably a lot more tolerance for let them merge and we'll see how it plays out, and competition will rise up if it was a bad deal. I don't think that reflects reality necessarily all the time, and the airline industry is a perfect example of that, where the consolidation has not been met with replacement competition where the markets are failing in certain respects. So, but mergers less so, but Section 2 for sure.
Last question, then we'll let you go. The any mergers that stand out to you in the airline industry as particularly problematic, ones that already happened, have we seen negative consequences and that could be not you mentioned it'd be hard to unwind them, but at least from your perspective, the ones that really push the consolidation over the edge into.
The big three are United Continental, Delta Northwest, and American US Air. I mean, those really are the ones that consolidated. Some others, there were smaller ones along the way that maybe led up to that. I mean, I helped get through the American TWA. It wasn't even a merger. TWA was about to close up shop just like Spirit had, but those three in particular are, and then the problem was once one happened, then everyone pointed at that one and said, well, you need to let us consolidate too, or we're not competitive. And so those three combined that were all kind of justified by each other, I think is what really got us here. So
Well, Gene, pleasure talking to you. Really, really interesting, wide-ranging conversation. I'm excited to see what we will get out of antitrust enforcement in the airline industry going forward. And really, really can't thank you enough for doing this today.
happy to do it. It was fun. Thanks.
And thanks to our audience and everyone for joining us. This concludes the call. Bye-bye.